You've been chosen.
You've been chosen.
For when we look at the times, the culture that we live in now, everybody seems to be obsessed with how they look. And what we find is that many people want to appear to be good looking. They want to appear to be well qualified. They want to appear to be rich and powerful. And the world we live in measures one's value or worth oftentimes, listen, by how you look or what ability you have. In many circles, if you don't look the part, if your credentials, your resume does not meet certain standards, then you will not be chosen. And so we are somewhat taken by the unemployment rate and how many folks are unable to find employment. But then we have the issue of companies that do not want to hire somebody who look a certain way. Have I got any witnesses in here? And so after you have gone to 3 interviews, you have not been chosen or selected simply because of the way you look. And so as a result, we see both the young and we see the old getting all sorts, listen, all sorts of operations trying to look a certain way. Look at your neighbor and say, I hope that's real. Many people, they fear being rejected and ostracized by others, so they do everything possible just to be accepted. Some folks go through this entire long process in hopes that they will be chosen or selected for something in life. And you know what? What many folks need to know is they are made in the image of God, and they don't need anyone's approval except His. I'm going to preach anyhow, so y'all might as well. For the 139th Psalm says that we are fearfully and wonderfully made. If God wanted you to look different, He would have made you different. Your friends and even your family, they may not like your appearance, they may not choose or select you for anything, but I came to tell you that God has His own way of choosing us. It says in the 2nd chapter and the 5th verse, You say, well, I don't have much money and I don't have much to offer. But James says God has chosen the poor of this world to be rich in faith and heirs of the kingdom. Look at your neighbor and say, I may not have much money, but I'm still rich. Look at your neighbor and say, I may not be related to Bill Gates, and I may not be related to Oprah Winfrey, but I'm still an heir of the kingdom. Can I get a witness today? And I stop by to tell you that when God selects us, we got to be faithful and obedient. Look at your neighbor and say, neighbor, be faithful and be obedient. When God chooses us to work for him, there's something that we got to keep in our mind, and that is that things, I said things won't always be easy. Things won't always be sweet, and things won't always be rosy. You see, if you go back to the text, in verse number 16, the Lord says he will show Saul the things that he must suffer. Look at your neighbor and say, neighbor, you got to suffer sometimes. I know you want it easy. I know you want everything to go your way, but touch somebody. Say, neighbor, you got to suffer sometime in your life. You see, my brothers and my sisters, whether you be a pastor, whether you be a deacon, whether you be an usher, whether you be a choir member, whether you just be a member walking through the doors of the church, whatever the Lord calls you to do, you can expect to have to suffer. Sometimes Paul found out that when he began to stand for Christ, folks didn't like it. He discovered that he had more friends when he hated the church. He had more people that liked him when he was doing wrong. Look at Acts chapter 9, verse 21 through 23. Folks couldn't believe that Paul had changed. And what did they do? They plotted to kill him. Look at your neighbor and say, neighbor, sometimes folks will plot to destroy you. They may not physically kill you, but they'll talk about you. They'll hate on you, set traps for you. Can I get a witness? You see, when you remain faithful to the Lord, he will protect you. Touch somebody. Come on, touch somebody. Say, neighbor, don't worry about it. The Lord will protect you. Paul kept on preaching. He kept standing for the Lord. He made up in his mind that this was his purpose. This was his calling. And I wonder if anybody in here today made up in your mind that you know what your purpose is. You know what your calling is. You know what your gift is. He knew that God had chosen him, and he was not going to be distracted. He was not going to be disrupted. We have to realize that the devil, say the devil, come on, say the devil, is constantly trying to disrupt God's business. The devil is always trying to discourage those who God chooses. This is why Paul writes in 1 Corinthians 15:58, we gotta be steadfast, unmovable, always abounding in the work of the Lord. He tells the Romans not to worry, because if God be for us, who can be against us? Who shall separate us from the love of Christ? Shall tribulation, distress, persecution, famine, nakedness, peril, sword? I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. Yes, God not only chose Paul, but he used them as a great instrument to change the world. Look at your neighbor. Say, neighbor, God can and God will use you to change the world. I don't know about you, but I'm glad that God doesn't choose according to man's standards. I'm glad that though man looks at the outward appearance, God looks at my heart. Can I get a witness? The truth of the matter is, if we left it up to some folks, they would never choose me. They would never choose you. Can I get a witness? Look at your neighbor and say, neighbor, that's all right. That's all right, because you been chosen. And when God chooses, nobody will be able to stop.